Alright guys, and welcome to the latest episode of Muscle Owl Talks. I'm here with Zoe, the wonderful Zoe Hallam. And last year, this is International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day. Even though I'm a man and I shouldn't even be on this. I'm going to just push it over to Zoe as much as possible. But yeah, we have an episode out and we just thought we'd do another episode because last year Zoe had a fantastic episode with myself and Michaela, and you were talking about how you feel you're viewed as a woman, but a woman with a disability who uses a wheelchair. And for me, it was the first time I'd really questioned, because obviously growing up with my brother who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it was the first time I'd really looked as like women's issues from a disability standpoint and sort of address the difference there. What are your views? How do you feel about, well, certainly it's continued to move onwards, the women's movement with women's marches and the Me Too movement and everything. How do you feel about the women's movement, International Women's Day, but also from a disabled perspective?
I think there's been certainly in the last year a kind of more populist focus on diversity in general. I mean, you had the whole thing with the Oscars last year about the number of Black nominees, and there are various other kind of ways in which kind of diversity beyond just gender has become mainstream and has become discussed and has become talked about. I don't think disability has in the same way. And I certainly don't think disability through the lens of any of these other minority groups has really seen an increase in interest or publicity or anything like that. Certainly not from my perspective anyway. I'm sure there are people out there who disagree, but I don't feel like many of the discussions that have been happening, which are good, positive discussions, don't get me wrong, about representation and about equality and about equality of opportunity, have really encapsulated or included people with disabilities to any kind of real significant extent. I think it's just we're, as a group, often a bit behind the other minority groups in getting out there and getting heard and getting the changes in legislation and attitudes reflected across society. The other minority groups do tend to lead the way a little bit on that. I don't know why that is. I think there's a lot of disempowerment of disabled people generally, and there's a real lack of popular weight behind disability as a minority group. But I think there's also a lack of understanding of what that really means. In a very sort of, in kind of, everyone kind of understands what women are, and everyone kind of understands what ethnic minorities are. Not as many people understand what disability is and how it works and how it affects people. Yeah.
And so do you think as well there's a kind of an issue with, almost a natural issue with diversification or diversity within different movements? So diversity within the women's movement, is it just focused on certain ideas or ideals of women? How could it be more encapsulating?
I think a lot of the women's movement and a lot of the discussion is dominated by academics, by people who come from certain backgrounds and hold certain views, and there's been a conscious effort to try and expand who the leading voices in feminism are and who they represent, but that expansion has not included really people from backgrounds like mine, people who are disabled. They have included a lot more sort of Black and minority ethnic women, which is great, and they've included trans women, gay women, but not as substantially women from lower socioeconomic groups, for example, and that often includes women with disabilities.
If I'm cynical, is it because disability doesn't sell, or is it just it's coming? It'll be.
And if disability was going to sell anywhere, I would have thought it would be in the context of another minority group such as feminism. I mean, if you are a disabled feminist, then you're speaking on a platform of feminism, and you're just bringing your own perspective to that. So it's not necessarily about disability being a sexy issue or being an issue that people are interested in. I think if there was a more active attempt to have disabled women as part of the feminist sort of leadership, I mean, I know that's not an organized hierarchy or anything, but have some of the prominent voices in feminism being voices of people with disabilities, whether they're talking about being disabled or not, then I don't think that would be an issue, because, as I say, the platform is feminism, and then disability is kind of like a side note to that. It's it's an additional flavor of feminism, but it's not the main point. Whereas when you've got people who are specifically disability activists, and that becomes a lot more difficult, because that people aren't interested in that. People don't think disability issues are particularly interesting. But when you view them through the lens of feminism, people start to get a bit more find that a bit more interesting to talk about. Yeah,
and I guess if there were women's rights activists watching who were like, they maybe were thinking, yeah, gosh, okay, I've not thought about women with disabilities rights before. How would you define them as, what are the differences between some of the difficulties that women face in general in 2018, 21st century society, versus some of the difficulties that a woman with a disability faces?
Well, I've talked a little bit before about how women with disabilities often experience sexism in very different ways. So you're much less likely to be sort of catcalled on the street. You're much less likely to have people make assumptions or treat you differently because of your gender. It's much more likely to be because of, well, this is, I guess, more for people with obvious or visible disabilities than people with invisible ones. But if you are noticeably disabled, then that is what people will see. So your experience of being a woman is very different, because you don't, and it's a weird kind of privilege, but you don't get that same harassment. You don't get that same kind of everyday sexism directed at you. You see it and experience it through the eyes of others. And you might, my friends and I were having a little rant on WhatsApp earlier about quite a few of them had sort of sexist incidents over the last couple of days, and we're just talking about it. So you're very aware that it goes on, but you may not be directly sort of a victim of those things. Where women with disabilities have particular issues related to sort of being female is things like accessing services for women. So, for example, if you are trying to seek shelter, if you're trying to escape an abusive relationship, or you need somewhere to go, a lot of women's shelters are not wheelchair accessible. If you're trying to get sort of contraception advice, or smear tests, or any kind of women's health checks, a lot of places don't have the facilities that were required for disabled women to access those. So it's things like that become much more of an issue as a disabled woman than maybe the more kind of well-known issues around feminism, around harassment, and around sexual assault. Sexual assault still does happen to women with disabilities, don't get me wrong, but there's a whole other spectrum of things that are not a problem for able-bodied women that are a real problem for women with disabilities.
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating, because that really goes to show that, even though there are aspects where you see things entirely differently as a disabled woman, all the same things, like access to all the same things, are still needed and aren't always there, and aren't always thought about. In terms of all of that, how do you think things can move forward for disabled women's rights?
It's the same way that things can move forward for any disabled anyone's rights. At the end of the day, it's about having disability as something that's not an afterthought. It's not a side note. Any area of policy that you think about, should be taking into account the needs of the whole spectrum of people that it represents. When you talk about housing, it's like, well, okay, when you build new housing, surely you should assume that there's going to be some disabled people who want to use that housing, or disabled people who want to visit the people who use that housing, or, you know, there's all kinds of things like that, rather than being like, oh, we've built 50 houses, now we need to build a disabled one on the end. It's just there's an attitude adjustment that hasn't happened that really needs to happen. And that's the same for feminism. It's the same for any kind of social movement, or any kind of legislation, or any kind of government policy. It's about considering disabled people and other minority groups that are also underrepresented as part of the core, rather than as part of the sort of add-ons that come later.
Yeah. Well, brilliant. And I guess, what would you say to anyone watching part of the women's movement, or wants to be part of the women's movement? How can they educate themselves moving forward?
I think, you know, there are a lot of voices out there who are saying similar things to the things that I'm saying. It's just not necessarily reflected as part of the women's movement on a larger scale. So, you know, try and find those voices out, and try and learn a little bit about the different perspectives on what it means to be a woman, and the difficulties and challenges that arise for people who aren't necessarily as represented by feminism as they might be. You know, and this isn't just disabled women, you know, this is trans women, this is women who aren't degree level educated. There's so many women out there who don't fit the kind of mold that a lot of key feminists kind of relate to. And it's really easy to start to understand those perspectives if you just, you know, go and talk to people and listen and read and try and think about the bigger picture, the broader spectrum of feminism.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you as always, Zoe. Brilliant. And thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye bye.